In February of 2026, a 4-bedroom ranch house in Albuquerque sold for $1.3 million. Nice house, nothing special about it architecturally. Built in 1972, 2 bathrooms, a pool out the back, the sort of place you'd drive past 1,000 times without ever looking twice. The family who owned it had lived there since 1973, 52 years. And they sold it because they were tired of strangers throwing pizza onto their roof. That's where we're starting tonight, because it tells you something about the whole subject. Breaking Bad is one of the best made shows anyone has ever put on television. Almost nobody argues about that. What people argued about was everything that spilled out of it afterwards. The city it filmed in, the fans it created, the drug it put on screen, the woman who played the wife. We've got a long list to work through tonight in no particular order and nothing dramatic waiting at the end of it. If you go under somewhere in the middle, you haven't missed anything. That's rather the point. If you keep something like this on most nights, the subscribe button is down there somewhere and I'd appreciate it, right? Let's get into it. There was a Facebook page called I Hate Skylar White. Thousands of people liked it. There was a second one with a name that the New York Times, when it eventually wrote about all this, decided it could not print. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it's genuinely strange. This is a fictional woman. She does not exist. She has no opinions, no bank account, no capacity to be hurt. And yet, by 2013, there were organized online communities whose entire purpose was hating her. And the hatred had grown large enough and loud enough that the actress playing her felt she had to write about it in a national newspaper. That op-ed came out in August of 2013, right as the final episodes were airing. Anna Gunn wrote it herself, and it was titled, I Have a Character Issue. It's a genuinely good piece of writing, and the thing I always come back to is how puzzled she sounds at the start of it. Not angry, puzzled. She describes watching the reaction build and simply not understanding the mechanism, the way you'd not understand a magic trick. Her argument, once she works it out, is that Skylar stopped being a character and turned into a kind of Rorschach test. People were looking at her and seeing whatever they already believed about women who don't go quietly. Gunn put the question about as directly as anyone could. Was it that they couldn't stand a woman who wouldn't suffer in silence, who wouldn't stand by her man, who wouldn't back down? Or was it, and this is a line that stuck with everyone because she was, in fact, Walter's equal? Now, you can disagree with that reading. Plenty of people did at the time, and plenty still do. There's a perfectly reasonable case that Skylar was written to be frustrating in the early seasons, that she blocks things the audience wants to happen, that the affair with Ted made a lot of viewers check out. Fine. That's a normal argument about a normal character. What wasn't normal was where it went. The hatred stopped staying inside the fiction. It migrated. People started addressing Gunn directly as though she'd personally done these things, and the tone got uglier the further it went. And at one point, it crossed into something that read like a genuine threat against her life. She went to law enforcement about it. That detail didn't come out for years afterwards, and when it did, it reframed the whole thing for a lot of people. This wasn't a woman being precious about mean tweets. She was frightened enough to involve the police. Gunn has talked about it since with a lot more distance. Her read, looking back, is that what she had walked into was an undercurrent of extreme sexism that had been sitting there the whole time, and that the show simply gave it something to point at. She's described being shocked at how deeply ingrained the assumptions about gender roles turned out to be, coming from people who presumably would have said, if you asked them directly, that they didn't hold those views at all. And she said something else that I find quite moving, which is that once she'd written the piece and it was out there, she felt like she'd been of service. Other actresses were going through versions of the same thing on other shows. Nobody had put a name to it. She did. Here's the comparison that makes the whole thing snap into focus, and I'll only make it once. Hank Schrader also opposed Walt. Hank spent 5 seasons trying to catch him, actively working to destroy everything Walt was building, and Hank is beloved. People adore Hank. Marie was disliked, but in the ordinary way that you dislike a slightly exhausting relative, and nobody built a website about it. Walt Jr. spent most of the show being annoyed at his father, and the audience broadly sided with him. So the opposition to Walt wasn't the problem. Something else was going on with Skylar specifically. Vince Gilligan clearly found the whole business unpleasant. He defended the character repeatedly and publicly, more than he needed to, and he's still visibly bothered by it in interviews years later. There's a version of a showrunner who quietly enjoys that kind of fan energy because it means people are engaged. He wasn't that. He kept saying in various ways that Skylar was right about everything and that the audience was watching the show wrong, which is a slightly awkward position for a writer to be in if you think about it. You've built a machine designed to make people root for a man doing terrible things. It has worked exactly as designed, and now you're irritated that it worked. I'll say where I land, because I said I would. On a rewatch, and I've done a few, Skylar is the character who ages best. Everything she does makes sense the moment you stop treating Walt as the protagonist and start treating him as the problem. She's frightened, she's cornered, she's being lied to constantly by the person she's meant to trust most, and her response is to try to protect 2 children and a bank account while a man who thinks he's a genius sets fire to all of it. The affair is the only genuinely selfish thing she does across 5 seasons, and even that reads, to me, like someone trying to detonate a marriage they can't otherwise escape. The nice postscript is that the temperature has changed. Gunn has described a seismic shift in how fans approach her now. People come up to her at events and apologize, sometimes for things they personally never did, which must be an odd experience. The consensus quietly flipped somewhere around the late 2010s, and the same character who had hate pages built about her is now routinely described as one of the best written women on prestige television. Same performance, same scripts, same episodes sitting there unchanged on a streaming service. The only thing that moved was us. Let's talk about a toy. Specifically, a 6-inch plastic Walter White standing in his hazmat suit, sold with a detachable bag of cash and a detachable bag of blue crystal. Made by a company called Mezco, sold in the adult collectibles section, marked for ages 15 and up, sitting on a shelf in Toys R Us in October of 2014. The show had been off the air for a year at that point. The merchandise was still very much alive. A woman in Fort Myers, Florida, saw the figures and objected. Her name is Susan Shrivger, though she filed her petition on change.org under the name Susan Myers, and the petition itself is worth reading properly rather than through the jokes that got made about it afterwards. Her argument was that Toys R Us was known worldwide for having toys for children of all ages, and that stocking a doll with a bag of drugs attached to it was a dangerous deviation from that. Parents and grandparents shopping with their kids, she wrote, shouldn't be put in the position of having to explain why a toy comes with illegal narcotics, or why the man who sells those narcotics deserves an action figure. She gave one interview to a local Fox affiliate that produced the 2 lines everyone remembers. Kids mimic their action figures, if you will. And then, do you want your child in an orange jumpsuit? Here's the detail that got lost almost immediately, and that I think is the most interesting thing in the whole story. She liked the show. She said so directly. She described it as compelling viewing for adults. Her objection was never that Breaking Bad shouldn't exist. It was about shelf placement in a shop aimed at children. That's a much narrower and much more reasonable complaint than the version that went round the internet, which flattened her into a joke about a hysterical parent who'd never watched an episode. The petition climbed past 8,000 signatures and kept going. Toys R Us initially held the line, and their first statement was actually quite sensible. The figures were carried in very limited quantities. The packaging clearly noted they were intended for ages 15 and up, and they were shelved in the adult action figure area of the stores rather than next to the Barbies, which is all true and which is roughly what any retailer would say. Then, about 48 hours later, they folded completely. And the statement they folded with is one of my favorite pieces of corporate writing ever produced. They didn't say, "We have reviewed our policies," or "We take these concerns seriously." They said, "Let's just say the action figures have taken an indefinite sabbatical." Which is a joke. That's a company making a joke at its own expense in a press statement, and it tells you they knew exactly how silly the whole situation was and had decided the cheapest way out was to leave, smiling. Bryan Cranston got involved before the collapse, and he was extremely good at it. His first tweet on the 20th of October quoted the headline about the petition and added that he was so mad he was burning his Florida Mom action figure in protest. Then, once the sabbatical statement came out, he came back for a second go. Toys R Us had put the figures on indefinite sabbatical, he wrote. Word on the street was that they'd been sent to Belize. Nicely played, Florida Mom. For anyone who hasn't seen the show, or who has and has slept since, going to Belize is the euphemism Saul Goodman uses when he's suggesting somebody be quietly murdered. So Cranston made a joke about a toy being assassinated, delivered it in character-adjacent voice, and finished by congratulating his opponent. I have no notes. That's a perfect 3-sentence performance. Aaron Paul was less amused and rather more openly annoyed, which felt in character for him as well. The bit that fascinates me, though, is the counter-petition. A man called Daniel Pickett from Manhattan Beach in California started his own campaign backing Toys R Us and asking them to keep the figures. He wasn't doing it as a joke. Pickett came out of the adult collector community, and for that community, this was a real and recurring issue. Adult collectibles constantly getting pulled from mainstream shops because someone assumed anything sold in a toy shop must be for children. So you had two genuine, sincere petitions running against each other, both of them about who a shop is actually for. A quick aside on the collectibles side of this, because it's the part that never gets mentioned, and I find it genuinely interesting. The adult collectible market was, by 2014, an enormous business, and it had a persistent problem. The shops that carried it were shops with the word toys in the name, which meant that any figure aimed at a 35-year-old was sitting under a sign designed for a 5-year-old, and every so often somebody would notice and there'd be a row. That's the context Daniel Pickett was actually operating in when he started his counter petition. He wasn't defending a bag of fake meth on principle. He was pushing back on the assumption that a plastic figure is automatically a children's product, which is an assumption that had cost his hobby a lot of shelf space over the years. And you can see who won that argument in the long run, because look where adult collectibles get sold now. Specialist shops, dedicated online retailers, entertainment chains. Barely any of it goes through general toy retail anymore. So the fight in October 2014 wasn't really about Walter White at all. It was a small skirmish in a much longer, much duller commercial argument about who a shop is for, and Breaking Bad just happened to be the thing standing on the shelf when it kicked off. And then the whole thing turned out not to matter very much because the figures were pulled from Toys R Us. Mezco continued selling them directly, Walmart had them, eBay had them. Barnes & Noble, of all places, had them. If you wanted a Walter White with a little bag of fake meth in October 2014, the only shop in America that had become difficult about it was the one with the giraffe on the sign, which is where I always land on this one. The petition didn't remove the toy from the world. It removed the toy from one retailer. That retailer made a joke on the way out. The star of the show made a better joke, and the collector community made its point about being treated like children. Nobody involved comes out of it looking especially bad, and that's rare for an internet argument. Sometimes a controversy is just a shop deciding a fight isn't worth having. In January of 2014, a man called Kevin Abar stood up in Albuquerque and told reporters that the drug from the television program had arrived in real life. Abar was the assistant special agent in charge of Homeland Security investigations in New Mexico, which is a long job title for someone whose day involves watching what moves across the southern border. What he was describing was blue-tinted methamphetamine turning up in the Four Corners region, which is the bit where New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado all touch. His explanation was not mystical, it was marketing. Tinting the product blue was a way for distributors to advertise, to brand, to make their supply distinguishable from everyone else's in a market where every product looks identical. Put a color on it, and suddenly you have a name people can ask for. And his worry was very specific and quite sad. He said he was concerned that people would find it sexy, would want to try it because of what they'd seen, and that it was extremely addictive. He mentioned first-time users, teenagers who'd watch the show and wouldn't know the difference between what was on screen and what was in the bag. Now here's the part that turns the whole thing inside out, and it's the reason I wanted this section in the video at all. On the show, blue means pure. That's the entire logic of it. Walt's product is blue because of the specific route he uses. The color is a side effect of quality. And its blueness is a signature that competitors can't fake without faking the chemistry underneath. That's the mythology. Blue equals good. In reality, it was precisely backwards. Abar explained that the product arriving in New Mexico started out somewhere in the region of 80 to 90% pure, which is already high, and then secondhand dealers further down the chain were adding something to it to make it blue. So the coloring was applied after the fact by people with no interest in chemistry, using whatever they had, which meant the blue version was less pure than the plain version, and it was making people ill. The show's central symbol got imported into the real world and immediately inverted its own meaning. Blue stopped being a marker of a careful chemist and became a marker of something that had been messed about with by someone who wasn't. Agents also incidentally started finding red. It wasn't the first appearance either, which is the bit that complicates the neat version of this story. Blue meth had turned up in Kansas and Utah around 2010, which is 2 years into the show's run, but well before it became a mass audience phenomenon. Roughly 40 pounds of it seized across the 2 states. Police in Kansas City did speculate at the time that dealers were trying to copy what they'd seen on television, and that speculation got picked up and repeated everywhere, which is how Breaking Bad caused blue meth became a settled fact in a lot of people's heads. Then in 2013, there was a large seizure in Canadian County, Oklahoma, around 40 pounds again, valued at roughly $2.3 million. Canadian authorities found blue product around the same period. And then New Mexico in 2014, which got the headlines because of the obvious poetry of it landing in the state where they'd filmed the thing. So there's a real pattern, but there's also a second explanation sitting right alongside the fun one, and I think it's worth giving it equal time rather than pretending the entertaining answer is the only one. When police do a field test for methamphetamine, the standard reagent turns orange or brown when the result's positive. That's the signal. Officer takes a sample, adds the chemical, watches for a color change, but blue doesn't always mean yes for meth. Now imagine the sample is already blue. The test becomes considerably harder to read. It doesn't get anyone out of a charge because there are proper lab tests afterwards, and those don't care what color anything is, but it does muddy things at the roadside. Kansas police raised this possibility at the time as an alternative to the television theory, and investigators in Utah floated a third option, which was that coloring was simply a way for a specific supplier to mark their own product so that everyone downstream knew whose it was. 3 explanations: branding, evading a field test, and internal identification. They're not mutually exclusive, and there's no way to sort them out because the people who'd know aren't giving interviews. I find myself genuinely unsure which one dominates, and I've noticed that most write-ups pick the television answer because it makes the better story. Which it does, but it's worth saying out loud that drug dealers dyed their product to defeat a color-based test is not a less plausible explanation than drug dealers dyed their product because of a prestige cable drama, what I'll say is this. Whatever the original reason, once the show was enormous, the Blue absolutely acquired a second life as a sales pitch. Reports from various states describe Blue product being sold at close to double the price of ordinary supply on the claim that the color indicated superior purity, which was a lie. There is nothing about being blue that makes methamphetamine stronger, cleaner, or better, and quite a lot about how it was being achieved that made it worse. So the honest summary is that dealers watched the same show everybody else did, understood product differentiation better than most marketing graduates, and sold a worse product at a higher price using an idea they got off the telly. There's a horrible efficiency to that. I don't admire it, but I understand it. Right, this is the heaviest section in the video, and I'm going to handle it the way I'd want it handled, which means talking about courtrooms and sentences rather than anything else. No detail about substances, no methods, nothing useful to anybody. What interests me here is the strange spectacle of a television program being discussed seriously in front of judges. Because it happened repeatedly. Start in Washington in March of 2014. A sophomore at Georgetown University called Daniel Miltzman told his residential advisor that he'd produced ricin in his dorm room. He was 19, he'd been researching online and had watched a substantial run of episodes in which the poison features. What made the case unusual, and what the Washington Post picked up on at the time, was that the show became a genuine point of contention between the two sides in federal court. Prosecutors argued one interpretation of what he intended. His lawyers argued he'd made it to take his own life, not anyone else's. And both arguments turned on what he'd been watching. You had attorneys in a federal courtroom parsing the plot of a cable drama as evidence of a young man's state of mind, which is, whatever else it is, a very odd afternoon at work. He pleaded guilty to possession later that year. Then Liverpool, 2015, Muhammad Ali, 31, a computer programmer and a father of two, tried to buy ricin from a seller on the dark web. The seller was an FBI agent. The Old Bailey trial produced some genuinely surreal material. He was sent a harmless powder concealed in the battery compartment of a toy car, and the package had been treated with a marker substance. So when officers arrived at his home the following morning and put a UV light on him, his face lit up. That's how they confirmed he'd handled it. There was also a to-do list recovered from his computer, and it contained entries in the flat register of a normal person's reminders, including a note about having paid the supplier, sitting alongside searches for chinchillas, rabbits, animal rescue centers, and pocket-sized pets. The court heard he'd first learned about ricin from the show. The judge, Mr. Justice Saunders, was careful about this in sentencing. He said explicitly that there was no evidence of any terrorist plan and no evidence of any specific intended victim. Ali got 8 years for attempting to possess a chemical weapon. Then 2021, Boston, Ishtiaq Ali Sam, 37, formerly the head of advanced research at a biotechnology company with a doctorate in biomedical engineering and a CV that touched some of the most serious institutions in the country. He'd ordered 100 packets of castor beans online back in 2015. When federal investigators asked him about it, he told them he'd meant to buy 1 packet, not 100, and had wanted to grow them as decoration for his flat in Cambridge. That story didn't survive contact with the investigation. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice for lying about why he'd bought them, and prosecutors said he'd become interested in acquiring poisons after watching the show. Authorities did not say what, if anything, he intended to do. There's a version of this section where I stack these up as a scandal. I don't think that's honest, so I'm not going to. Because look at the shape of these cases. A depressed teenager with a to-do list about pet rabbits, a biotech executive who had also, separately, been accused of embezzling from his employer. These are not people who were fine until a television program reached them. They were already in trouble in 3 completely different directions. And the show gave a shape to something that was going to find a shape regardless. Ricin has been in the public consciousness since long before 2008. It's in Cold War history, it's in news coverage, it's in Agatha Christie's general vicinity. What Breaking Bad did was put it back in circulation vividly in a way people remembered. That's not nothing, it's also not causation. The one I find genuinely melancholy is Kuntal Patel in East London. She was a graphic designer in her 30s, who became the first person sentenced under the United Kingdom's Biological Weapons Act after trying to obtain poison in connection with her mother in a domestic situation that had been miserable for years. And the postscript to that case is that the two of them reconciled while she was in prison. That is not a Breaking Bad story. That's a family story that happened to borrow an idea from one. There's also an entire secondary genre of headline that this show generated, which is lighter, and which I do find funny. Anytime a chemistry teacher gets arrested anywhere in the English-speaking world, the phrase real-life Walter White appears within about 4 hours. John Gose, a former science teacher in New Mexico, pleaded guilty to meth-related charges after a 2016 arrest. 2 chemistry professors at Henderson State University in Arkansas were arrested in 2019 over allegations of manufacturing, and here's the detail that made it irresistible to every news desk on Earth. One of them had given an interview to the university's own student paper mentioning that he was particularly a fan of the show. The paper had run it under the headline, Henderson's Heisenberg, which is either the unluckiest piece of student journalism ever filed or the most prescient. I genuinely can't decide. And in Iowa, there was a case, State versus Rederath, where the state Supreme Court itself framed the matter in terms of life imitating art, because the alleged plot at the center of it was described as having been borrowed from the program. When your show gets name-checked in a Supreme Court opinion, you've achieved a level of cultural saturation that no marketing department can buy. None of this is Vince Gilligan's fault. I want to be completely clear about that because it's the honest position and because the alternative leads somewhere stupid. If a show is responsible for what its most damaged viewers do, then nothing can ever be made about anything. It is still, I think, a very strange thing to have attached to your name. You write a story about a chemistry teacher, and a decade later, there are transcripts. In 2006, somebody knocked on a door in northeast Albuquerque and asked if they could film the outside of the house for a pilot. That's how it starts. A location scout doing an ordinary day's work, walking a residential street looking for a place that reads as middle-class family, slightly tired, not doing brilliantly. The house at 3,828 Piermont Drive fit 4 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, built in 1972, about 1,900 square feet, pool out the back. Fran and Louis Padilla had bought it in 1973. It later passed to their daughter, Joanne Quintana. It was, by every account, an entirely normal family home, and the family said yes, presumably because a pilot is a thing that gets made and then usually vanishes and nobody thinks about it again. Only the exterior and the back garden were ever used. Every interior scene, every kitchen argument, every moment in that bedroom was shot on a set. The people living in that house never had a camera inside it. Then came the pizza. Season 3, an episode called Caballo Sin Nombre. Walt turns up at the house he's been thrown out of, holding a pizza, hoping to be let back in, and Skylar shuts the door on him. So he walks out into the front garden and hurls the entire thing onto the roof, where it lands flat, intact, and perfect. It's a wonderful bit of physical acting because Cranston clearly means it. And it's a wonderful bit of set dressing because the pizza sticks to the landing on the first take, which they've talked about since. Here's a fun detail, and this is the sort of thing I love about that production team. During a Reddit AMA in 2015, Gilligan explained that they'd had a long discussion before shooting about whether the pizza should be sliced. The problem was physics. A sliced pizza, thrown, comes apart in the air. It has to be one piece to fly. But no self-respecting pizza place sells an unsliced pizza, and they knew perfectly well that if they just ignored that, the audience would notice and would never let it go. So they wrote a line into the earlier scene explaining that the place doesn't slice them, they pass the savings on to you. That is a show worrying about aerodynamics and then covering its tracks in dialogue. No notes. And then the fans arrived. For a while, it was fine. People drove past, took a photograph from the street, drove off. Albuquerque started running tours. The house became a stop on the circuit. That's the deal you make roughly when you say yes to a location scout. And most of the family seemed to have taken it in reasonably good humor at first. But the pizza got recreated, over and over and over, which meant strangers standing in the front garden of a private home throwing food under the roof of a private home, and then leaving, and then somebody who lives there having to get a ladder out and scrape congealed cheese off their own tiles. Vince Gilligan finally lost patience with it in 2015, and he did it on the Better Call Saul Insider podcast, which is an unusual venue for a public telling off. He said they'd been hearing from the owner that people were wandering onto her property and being rude to her when she came out and told them they were on private land, that they were throwing pizzas onto roofs. And then the line that got quoted everywhere: "There is nothing original or funny or cool about throwing a pizza on this lady's roof. It's been done before. You are not the first." He followed it with something colder. "We love our fans," he said. "I don't love those fans. I don't consider them fans." Jonathan Banks, who plays Mike, was in the room and offered a considerably more direct version of the same sentiment involving what he'd do if he caught anyone at it. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work. If anything, it advertised the prank to people who hadn't thought of it. By 2017, the situation had got worse rather than better. Local reporting put it at something like 300 cars a day going past. Quintana told KOB that the family felt they couldn't leave the house, because whenever they did, something happened. And then somebody left a package at the door in the small hours, addressed to Walter White, which is the point at which the whole thing stops being an annoyance and becomes genuinely frightening because a stranger stood at your front door at night and left an object. Her brother said that was it. A 6-foot wrought iron fence went up. She said at the time that they didn't want to gate themselves in. They gated themselves in anyway. In January of 2025, the family listed the house for just under $4 million. Now, this is where I have to be careful not to be unkind because the price was not really their idea. The reporting on this is fairly clear. Someone who claimed to specialize in selling famous properties in Hollywood convinced the owner that this was the right number. Zillow's estimate for the place was in the region of $343,000. So they were asking roughly 11 times the automated valuation on the basis of fame. There was a plan behind it. The idea was that a buyer would turn it into a museum or a bed and breakfast, something that monetized the fandom. Quintana said as much publicly, and she was gracious about it. She said she hoped whoever bought it would make it what the fans wanted. If they want a bed and breakfast, if they want a museum, go for it. The problem is zoning. It sits in a residential neighborhood, and Albuquerque was not inclined to rezone a family street into a tourist attraction because a television show was filmed there. So the commercial plan was dead more or less on arrival. The house sat. It came off the market in August, went straight back on at the same price, sat some more, came off again in December. Then, in early February 2026, a new agent, Alicia File of Keller Williams, relisted it at $400,000, which, and this is the honest bit of the story, was roughly what the house was actually worth. Median prices around the metro at the time were sitting somewhere near $385,000. A 4-bedroom with a pool at $400,000 was a normal listing at a normal number. It went under contract in 6 days, around 20 offers. The agent said afterwards that she'd been genuinely surprised by the intensity of global interest for a series that ended more than a decade ago. It closed on the 24th of February for $1.3 million, $900,000 over asking. The buyer is the streamer Adin Ross, who announced it on a live stream and said he intends to turn the interior into a 1-to-1 recreation of the show, which is a slightly funny ambition given that the interior was never the show. He's talked about cash in the air vents, an RV out front, and a pizza staged on the roof. So the family left because of the pizza, and the man who bought it plans to start by putting one back. 53 years that house belonged to one family. The show ended in 2013, and in reality, there was never a real family still living there that finally moved out in 2026. Page A4, Albuquerque Journal, Friday the 4th of October, 2013. Among the real death notices, the ones placed by real families for real people, there was one for Walter White, 52 years old. Photograph of Bryan Cranston, cause of death given as a long battle with lung cancer and a gunshot wound. The text described him as a co-founder of Gray Matter, a research chemist who taught high school chemistry and later founded a meth manufacturing empire. It said a private memorial had been held by his family, and it closed by asking that, in lieu of flowers, donations be made to a drug abuse prevention charity of the reader's choice. The finale had aired the previous Sunday. It was placed by fans, and one of them was a man called David Lehman, a science teacher over in Los Lunas, who'd been watching since the beginning and had actually appeared as an extra in the pilot. His explanation was simple and rather sweet. The series was based in Albuquerque, he said, and this gives some of us some closure. The journal sold out. Physical copies of that Friday edition were gone across town, at a moment when the American federal government was in the middle of a shutdown, and there was a great deal of genuinely serious news happening. The online version of the story pulled something like 40 times the traffic of an average piece. The editor at the time, Kent Walls, sounded slightly stunned about it, and the paper did something I think was rather classy. In the follow-up article, they listed actual local drug abuse charities with addresses and phone numbers, so that anyone who'd read the joke obituary and felt moved by the line about donations could act on it. Transitional housing, addiction recovery programs, real organizations in a city with a real problem. 2 weeks later, they held the funeral, Sunset Memorial Park, Albuquerque, the 19th of October, organized largely out of a local steakhouse. There was a procession through the city streets, led by a hearse, followed by the RV, with sheriff's deputies in attendance and something like 80 fans driving behind. Roughly 200 people came. Some had flown in from Ireland, some from Switzerland. The set decorator from the show, Michael Flowers, delivered the eulogy, which is a genuinely lovely detail because he's exactly the right sort of person to do it. Not an actor, not a producer, the man who dressed the rooms. Attendees paid to be there, and for their money, they could throw a handful of dirt onto an empty coffin. A real coffin and a real plot, with a real headstone bought and installed by the organizers. The whole thing was a charity event. It raised somewhere around $17,000 for Albuquerque healthcare for the homeless, which is not a token amount for a fan gathering, and which is money that went to people sleeping rough in the city that show made famous. And then it went wrong, because Sunset Memorial Park is not a film set. It's a working cemetery. There are people buried there, and their families visit them. A man called Manuel Montano spoke to KOB about it, and what he said cut through everything. His son is buried about 15 yards from where the makeshift grave went in. This is a place of mourning, he said. It's not a spectacle. I've read a lot of quotes putting this research together, and that's the one I keep coming back to. Because he isn't wrong, and neither, really, were the organizers. Nobody set out to hurt him. They raised $17,000 worth of good, roughly, for homeless people, and they did it in a way that meant a grieving father had to watch a crowd of tourists cheering at a fake grave near his son. A petition followed, asking for the headstone to be removed. The cemetery's general manager, Von Hendren, gave a statement that was about as clear as a statement can be. We are a cemetery first and foremost. Our allegiance lies with our families that have allowed us to bury their loved ones here. The headstone came out. There's one more piece to this that I want to flag carefully because I found it reported at the time, but I'd want to double check it before I'd swear to it. The plan had apparently been to live stream the funeral on YouTube to bring in more donations from fans worldwide, and reports at the time said Sony and AMC blocked the stream on copyright grounds, with organizers getting the news about 15 minutes before it was due to start. If that's accurate, and I've seen it in more than one place, it's a marvelously bleak little coda, a studio issuing a takedown against a charity funeral for a character it invented. Everybody in the story was sincere. That's what makes it difficult rather than stupid. The fans genuinely wanted closure and genuinely raised money. The paper genuinely tried to point that money somewhere useful. The cemetery genuinely had an obligation to the families who trusted it. And Manuel Montano genuinely just wanted to visit his son without a crowd. You can't design a version of this where nobody gets hurt. They just found out the hard way. This one is harder to be flippant about than most of what we've covered, so I won't be. Breaking Bad had a particular habit that separated it from most of its contemporaries, and it's the reason certain episodes still cause arguments among people who otherwise agree about everything. The show was willing to put children inside the consequences, not in the way that dramas usually do, where a child is endangered for 2 acts and then rescued, properly inside it. The first big one is Brock, Andrea's son, 6 years old, poisoned in season 4, so that Jesse would believe Gus had done it and would turn back to Walt. He survives, and the show is careful to establish that what he was given was not the ricin Jesse feared, but berries from a lily-of-the-valley plant, a garden shrub, calculated to make a child extremely ill without killing him. The reveal is that potted plant sitting on Walt's patio at the end of the season, and it's one of the great final shots in television because it recontextualizes an entire year of storytelling in about 2 seconds without a word of dialogue. But think about what it establishes. Walt calculated a dose. He worked out how much would make a small boy nearly die and not quite. That's not a crime of passion or a panicked reaction in a basement. That's arithmetic performed on a child. There was a poll a few years back asking fans which scenes they'd have refused to film, and the child-harming material came out at the top end of it, which doesn't surprise me at all. It's the thing people forgive least, and they're right not to. The second one is Drew Sharp, and this one is worse because it's more casual. Season 5, the episode Dead Freight, which is the train heist, and it's a marvelous piece of television. Genuinely thrilling, funny in places, an enormous logistical set piece that the show pulls off perfectly. Everyone is elated, they've done it, nobody was hurt. And then a boy on a dirt bike who has been in the background of the episode a couple of times collecting a tarantula in a jar comes over the rise and waves at them. Todd takes out a gun and shoots him. The episode ends there. No music, no speech, no processing. The show simply stops. I remember the reaction to that at the time, and it was unlike anything else the series produced. Not outrage exactly. Something closer to being winded. People who had watched 2 men be dissolved in acid and a man's face be removed by a bomb found this considerably harder, and I think the reason is the tarantula, because it made him a person with an afternoon. Then there's Holly in Ozymandias. After everything has collapsed, Walt takes the baby, puts her in the truck, and drives off. And for a stretch of that episode, the audience genuinely does not know what he intends, because by that point in the story, he has become a man about whom you cannot rule things out. He brings her back. He leaves her in a fire station. And on the way, he makes that phone call to Skylar, the one performed for the police he knows are listening, where he says all the cruelest things he can think of in the voice of a monster in order to put every crime on himself and get her out from under it. Which brings up the most divisive interpretive question in the entire series, and this one has never really been resolved. Is that call an act of love, a father spending the last of himself to protect his wife legally? Or is it a man finally getting to say what he actually thinks, with an alibi built in? The honest answer is that Cranston plays it as both simultaneously, deliberately, and if you watch his face rather than listening to the words, you can see the second thing leaking out through the first. The kidnapping was the moment a lot of viewers stopped being able to hold on to any version of Walt as sympathetic, which was, I suspect, precisely the intended function. I don't think any of this was gratuitous. That's the distinction I'd want to draw. A gratuitous show harms a child for shock and then moves on. Breaking Bad harmed children in order to close off the audience's escape routes one by one, until there was nowhere left to stand where Walt still looked like a man doing a difficult thing for his family. It's not enjoyable. It was never meant to be. But it's the opposite of careless, and I defend it on those grounds even on the nights when I'd rather skip the episode. Let's start with two numbers, because everything that follows is the shape those two numbers make. Season 1 of Breaking Bad cost somewhere around $3 million an episode to produce. AMC's license fee, the amount the network paid to air it, was around $1.65 million. Sit with that gap. The people making the show were spending more than the people showing it were paying, which is normal enough in television because studios recoup later through syndication and international sales and eventually streaming. But it means that from the very first episode, there was a structural tension between Sony, who owned the show, and AMC, who broadcast it. Somebody was going to have to blink eventually. Around 2010, AMC started signaling to Sony and to Gilligan that they thought Season 3 might be the end. Now I want to be fair to AMC here, because they're the villain of most tellings of this, and it's not entirely deserved. Their live viewing figures were modest. This was a critically adored show that a comparatively small number of people were actually watching on the night. In the old model, that's a cancellation, so Sony went shopping, and they got interest fairly quickly, most notably from FX, who were apparently prepared to take it for 2 more seasons. At which point AMC changed their mind and kept it. Nothing focuses a network's affection like somebody else wanting the thing. And then the other half of the story shows up at almost exactly the right moment, which is one of those pieces of luck that makes you wonder how much of television history is just timing. Netflix at that point was aggressively buying content for its streaming service. Sony made a deal to put Breaking Bad on there and then pushed hard to get the back catalog up in time for Season 4 rather than waiting, precisely because they knew AMC had the show on a cancellation footing and they wanted the audience numbers to move before the next negotiation. It worked spectacularly. People who had never watched an episode sat down and consumed 4 seasons in a fortnight and then turned up live for the 5th because now they couldn't wait. The Season 5 premiere drew more than double what the Season 4 premiere had. Gilligan has been unambiguous about this. On Emmy night he said flatly that he thought Netflix kept them on the air, not helped, kept them on the air, which brings us to August 2011 and the fight going public. AMC's proposal for the final season was that it be cut down to 6 or 8 episodes instead of the 13 they'd been doing. That was a cost-saving measure, straightforwardly. The producers said no, so Sony started shopping it again, and this time did it noisily, which is a negotiating tactic as much as a genuine search. Reports had them talking to other cable networks. AMC's president, Charlie Collier, was out doing interviews saying he was optimistic the show would stay. Everyone could read the subtext. The deal closed on the 14th of August, 2011. 16 episodes. Both Sony and AMC contributing to the budget, which was the compromise on the sticking point. Gilligan issued a statement calling it a great gift to the writers, which it was, because 16 episodes to land an ending is an enormous amount of runway compared to what most shows get. Then in April 2012, Cranston let slip the bit that annoyed everyone. Those 16 episodes were going to be split into 2 halves of 8, airing a year apart. Fans were not delighted. Critics were not delighted. It felt like a commercial decision dressed as a creative one, and honestly, it probably was. Although I'll say this in its defense, the split produced 2 of the most sustained periods of collective television anticipation I can remember, and it gave the second half a run-up that a normal season wouldn't have had. The gap is part of why the ending landed the way it did. That may have been an accident, it still worked. The wider context is worth mentioning because AMC was, at that moment, having an absolutely torrid time with everybody. They'd spent an age negotiating with Matthew Weiner over Mad Men, which delayed that show's 5th season. They'd fired Frank Darabont off The Walking Dead days after he'd promoted it at Comic-Con. The Hollywood Reporter ran a piece describing a network with a reputation for squeezing budgets hard enough that some showrunners and their agents were choosing not to bring their best material there at all. There's a detail in that reporting I find quite funny in a bleak way. When Gilligan and Sony brought AMC the Better Call Saul idea, AMC apparently suggested they make a pilot first. A pilot from the man who had just delivered them 16 Emmys. Netflix quietly offered to take it straight to series, and AMC had to move. The lesson everyone took away is the one we're still living with. The traditional measurement, how many people watched it on the night, had stopped describing reality. The show that AMC nearly canceled for low ratings was, by any modern metric, one of the most valuable properties on television. They just couldn't see it with the instruments they had. I've got a whole video planned on the early streaming era and how it rearranged what a hit even means, so I won't go further down that road tonight. But this is where a lot of it starts. At one point, 85,000 people were sharing the same file at the same moment. That's the image I can't get out of my head about this one. Not a number on a chart. 85,000 individual computers scattered across every time zone, each holding a fragment of the same 47 minutes and handing pieces of it to each other in the middle of the night, in the hours after the finale went out. The figures come from Torrent Freak, who track this sort of thing obsessively. Their count was that Felina was downloaded more than 500,000 times, within 12 hours of the first copy appearing online. That made it comfortably the most pirated episode in the show's history. Now, the raw number is impressive, but it's not the interesting part. The interesting part is the map. Torrent Freak sampled the users and broke it down by country, and the results were not what you'd expect if you assume piracy is mostly about people who can't afford things. Australia came top at around 18% of the total. The United States, where the episode had just aired on television, was around 14%. The United Kingdom was around 9%. Australia was, at that point, one of the wealthiest countries on Earth. What Australia didn't have was a straightforward legal way to watch the thing on the night. The UK number is low, precisely because Netflix was putting the final episodes up within about a day of the American broadcast, so British viewers could simply press play and go to bed. So the distribution wasn't tracking wealth or morality, it was tracking availability. Where the show was easy to watch legally, people watched it legally. Where it wasn't, they didn't, and no amount of finger-wagging was going to change that. Gilligan got asked about it by the BBC not long afterwards, and I like his answer because he refused to give a clean one. He said there were two sides to the coin, and that he was going to be honest about both. In some ways, he said, the illegal downloading had helped them, certainly in terms of brand awareness. And then, immediately, the downside is that a lot of folks who worked on the show would have made more money, himself included, if all those downloads had been legal. He wasn't being cute about it either. He went on to say piracy was ultimately a problem and would continue to be a problem going forward. Because we all need to eat, we all need to get paid. That's a properly grown-up position, and it's rarer than it should be. He didn't do the thing where a creator poses as a rebel and says piracy is fine, actually, and he didn't do the thing where a creator lectures the audience about theft. He just said, it built us an audience, and it cost my crew money, and both of those are true. The comparison everybody reached for at the time came from Jeff Bewkes, then running Time Warner, who'd said on an earnings call that being the most pirated show in the world was better than an Emmy because it drove buzz and eventually drove subscriptions. He was talking about Game of Thrones, which beat Breaking Bad to the annual crown that year. Breaking Bad finished second with something in the region of 4 million downloads across the year, and The Walking Dead came third, which meant AMC had 2 of the top 3. There's a footnote to the piracy story that I think is worth a minute because it involves the same fight from the opposite direction. For a long stretch, the legal way to watch this show in a lot of the world was genuinely confusing. Rights were carved up territory by territory, which is normal in the industry and completely baffling if you're a person with a laptop. Netflix had it here, somebody else had it there. One country got it a day later and another got it 8 months later. And in several places, the only legal option was to buy a boxed set that hadn't been released yet. You can see the consequences in the numbers we just went through. The countries that pirated hardest were not the poorest ones. They were the ones where the show was, in practical terms, unbuyable on the night. What I find quietly funny about that is that the studio's own strategy created the problem. Sony sold the rights the traditional way, region by region, because that's how you maximize the money. And the traditional way is exactly what produced a situation where 500,000 people took it instead. Gilligan didn't say that, obviously, he wouldn't. But it's sitting underneath everything he did say about needing to get paid, and I suspect he knew. Here's my honest reaction to this whole section, which is that it's aged into something almost quaint. Because look at what the argument was. The argument was that a thing existed, people wanted it, and there was no legal way to obtain it in your country on the day it came out. That was a real and widespread problem in 2013. The entire streaming industry then spent a decade solving it by making everything available everywhere immediately. And for a few years, it genuinely was solved. And now, of course, we've unsolved it. Everything is split across 9 services, shows vanish off platforms with no warning, things get removed for tax purposes and become genuinely unobtainable, and prices have crept up every year while the catalogs have got thinner. Piracy figures have gone back up. Nobody should be shocked. There's something a bit poetic about the fact that the show which proved streaming could rescue a dying series is also the show that proved people will take it by force if you don't sell it to them properly. Both lessons were available in 2013. The industry learned one of them. This one starts in a budget meeting, which is not where you'd expect the most divisive hour of a prestige drama to begin. Season 3 had gone badly over. Gilligan told Esquire that they were millions of dollars over budget, to the point where, in his phrasing, they had to do something. And the something available to a television production in that situation is well established and has a name: a bottle episode. 1 location, minimal cast, no travel, no builds, no crowd. You take a set you've already paid for and you stay in it for 47 minutes. What they built with that constraint was Fly, written by Sam Catlin and Moira Walley-Beckett, directed by Ryan Johnson, his first of 3 on the show, and shot by Michael Slovis. 2 actors on screen, Cranston and Paul, with nobody else in it apart from some extras in the laundromat above. The plot, if you can call it that: Walt notices a fly in the super lab, becomes convinced it will contaminate the cook, and refuses to leave until it's dealt with. He falls off a catwalk trying to swat it. He ends up trapped down there overnight with Jesse, exhausted, sleep-deprived, saying things he would never say. And the audience split down the middle in a way it never did for any other episode. On IMDb, Fly sits at 8.0 out of 10. It is the lowest rated episode of the series, and it's the only one anywhere below 8. Which sounds like a verdict until you notice that 7.8 would be a good week for most shows on television, and that the same audience which put it last also put Ozymandias at a flat 10. The critics, meanwhile, went the other way, almost entirely. The AV Club gave it an A, and praised Johnson's direction specifically, arguing that it would have been strong even shot conventionally, and that with the choices Johnson made, it was one of the most distinctive hours of television that year. James Poniwozik in Time called it the most unusual and very possibly the best episode of the show. Gilligan has never wavered on it. He's acknowledged openly that it's divisive, he's been perfectly candid that it existed for financial reasons, and he's also said that people who claim the episode is about nothing are not watching it closely enough. It remains one of his favorites. I'm with him, and I'll tell you why briefly, because I don't want to turn this into an essay. The complaint is that nothing happens. But something enormous happens. Walt spends an entire night circling the thing he did to Jane and getting close enough to almost say it and then not saying it, and the fly is the object he's chosen to be furious at instead. It's a man trying to locate a single contaminant in a system he has personally poisoned. If that's filler, it's the most loaded filler ever produced. And there's a lovely piece of symmetry sitting on top of it. Rian Johnson directed both the lowest rated episode of Breaking Bad and the highest rated one. Same director, opposite ends of the entire scoreboard. I don't think that's a coincidence so much as evidence that he was the person they handed the strange ones to. Since we're on the subject of choices that split the audience, let's talk about the planes. Season 2 ends with a mid-air collision directly above Albuquerque. A commercial jet and a small charter aircraft. 167 people killed across both. Debris raining down on the neighborhood and a charred pink teddy bear landing in Walt's swimming pool while he stands there watching. The chain of causation is deliberately long. Walt let Jane die. Jane's father was an air traffic controller. He came back to work still grieving. A call sign reminded him of his daughter, his attention slipped, and 2 aircraft occupied the same piece of sky. A lot of people found this contrived at the time. The accusation was that it was a coincidence dressed up as consequence, an act of God dropped on the ending because the writers wanted a big image. Gilligan's answer to that is my favorite thing he's ever said about his own work. He pointed out that it's the opposite of Deus Ex Machina, the God from the machine who arrives to solve everything. He suggested a different term for what they'd done, Lucifer Ex Machina, the devil from the machine. Not a rescue arriving from nowhere, but a punishment arriving from something the man himself set in motion several seasons earlier in a bedroom by choosing to stand there and do nothing. And here's the fun detail that I think settles the argument about whether it was planned. The episode titles of Season 2, Episode 1 is 737, Episode 4 is Down, Episode 10 is Over, Episode 13 is ABQ. Read them in order. 737, Down, Over, ABQ. They wrote the headline of the crash into the titles of the season, one word at a time, across 13 episodes from the first one. And each title also has a perfectly ordinary meaning within its own episode, so nobody spots it. The 737 in the premiere is the amount of money Walt calculates he needs, $737,000, which then quietly turns out to be the model number of the aircraft. That is showing off. It's absolutely showing off. But you've earned the right to show off if you can plan a punchline 13 episodes ahead and land it. In 2013, a critic coined a phrase, and it never really went away. Emily Nussbaum was writing about Breaking Bad for The New Yorker, and in a column around Ozymandias, she used the term bad fan. What she meant by it was a viewer who is watching a show for the wrong reasons. Somebody who looks at Walter White and sees a kick-ass genius rather than a man destroying everyone within reach. Someone enjoying, uncritically and enthusiastically, the exact behavior the program is asking them to be horrified by. The idea came directly out of the reaction we talked about earlier, the venom aimed at Skylar. That was Nussbaum's evidence. If a section of the audience hates the woman trying to stop the murders more than they hate the murders, something has gone sideways in the transaction between show and viewer. And the phrase caught on immediately, partly because it named something everyone had noticed, and partly because it was a little bit rude. And critics enjoy that. Matt Zoller Seitz put the sharpest version of it in Vulture. There is no Team Walt, really, he wrote, unless you're a sociopath. Which is a great line, and also, I think, not quite fair, and I want to give the other side properly rather than nodding along. James Poniwozik wrote a piece in Time before the finale which said, essentially, hang on. He wanted Walt to get away with it. He said so plainly he wanted him driving across the desert with Holly and a truck full of money, off to start again somewhere the way Mike had hoped to. And his objection to the whole bad fan framework was that it had got sanctimonious, that people were treating a question about a television program as a test of your worth as a human being. He has a point, and here's why I think he does. The show spent 5 seasons building an extraordinarily sophisticated machine for making you sympathize with this man. That's craft. The cancer diagnosis in the first 10 minutes, the humiliation at the car wash, the wealthy former colleagues who got rich off his work. The whole first season is engineered to put you on his side so that the descent has somewhere to descend from. If you build that machine, run it beautifully for 62 hours, and it works, you don't then get to be surprised that it worked. Wanting Walt to win isn't a moral failure. It's the intended emotional experience colliding with a moral judgment, which is precisely the friction the show was designed to produce. The discomfort is the point. Where I think Nussbaum is unarguably right is at the edges. There's a difference between feeling the pull and not noticing there's a pull, between rooting for him in the moment and building a t-shirt with his face on it that says, "I am the one who knocks," without a flicker of irony. Which brings me to the theory that came out of the finale, and it's a strange one. Nussbaum, writing after Felina, floated the idea that the last episode isn't real. Her reading was that everything works out so neatly for Walt, so exactly according to his own wishes, that it reads less like a plot and more like a wish. Her suggestion was that he froze to death in that snow-covered Volvo in New Hampshire, and that the entire finale is what a dying man imagines. You have to admit it's tidy. The car starts on the first turn of a screwdriver. He gets past a nationwide manhunt to sit in his old kitchen. He terrifies the Schwartzes, secures the money for his son, poisons Lydia, kills the Nazis, frees Jesse, and dies in a lab, alone on his own terms, with nobody catching him. Norm Macdonald, of all people, agreed with her publicly. He never made it out of that car in the snow, he wrote, which is quite a beautiful sentence for a comedian to produce about a drama. Gilligan shut it down, firmly and repeatedly. The finale happened, all of it, in the ordinary reality of the show. And then El Camino came along in 2019 and settled it entirely by showing us what Jesse did afterwards. You cannot make a sequel about a man who escaped a compound if the escape was somebody else's hallucination. But I don't think that kills the underlying observation, which is the more interesting part anyway. Linda Holmes at NPR made a version of it without the dream theory attached, that the finale lands a little too cleanly, that Walt gets a degree of control over the shape of his own ending, which the previous 5 seasons had spent a great deal of energy suggesting he would never be allowed. And Gilligan more or less conceded the underlying charge in his way. He said before it aired that people who wanted some redemption for Walt were the ones most likely to leave happy, which is an unusual thing for a writer to say about his own ending. He knew what he'd made. There's one more piece to this, and it's the piece I find genuinely clever. Todd Alquist arrives in season 5 as a polite young man who wants to learn, admires Walt enormously, calls him Mr. White, and is unfailingly courteous while doing appalling things. He absorbs everything about Walt's competence and precisely none of the horror. He is, if you look at him a certain way, a fan. Several critics made this argument at the time that Todd is the show's own portrait of the bad fan, a character who watched Heisenberg and thought that looks like a good way to live. Whether the writers meant it that way, I genuinely don't know. Gilligan's team were quite capable of that kind of construction, as we established with the Season 2 episode titles. I go back and forth on this whole section, and I've never settled it, which is why I like it. Is a show responsible for how it's misread? Probably not. Should it be aware that it will be? Probably yes. Can you build something this seductive and then be cross that people were seduced? I don't know. I've had that argument with myself for about a decade now, and I've never won. Start with a demographic fact because it frames everything else. Albuquerque is a plurality Hispanic city. New Mexico is a majority Hispanic state. And the family at the center of Breaking Bad, the household the camera actually lives in, is not. That isn't automatically a criticism. Plenty of good stories are about a specific family in a specific place, and it would be daft to demand that every drama be a census. But it does mean that the show made a choice about whose interior life it was going to render in full. And the criticism that grew up around it is fundamentally about where the complexity got distributed. Because look at who the early antagonists are. Crazy 8, who Walt kills in a basement in the first few episodes. Tuco Salamanca, introduced by beating a man half to death in a scrapyard for the crime of speaking. The cousins, Leonel and Marco, who barely speak at all and function more as weather than as people. Hector ringing a bell. If you'd stopped watching at the end of season 2, and quite a lot of academic criticism effectively does stop there because that's where the pattern is starkest, you'd have a fairly clear picture. The white characters have marriages and doubts and long conversations about their own choices, and the Latino characters arrive, are violent, and leave. There's a visual argument on top of the casting one. Whenever the show goes to Mexico, the image changes. It gets a heavy yellow filter over it so that the scene reads immediately as elsewhere. Critics have made the point that this does a lot of unexamined work. It says foreign, it says hot, it says dangerous, and it says all of it before a word of dialogue. And the Mexico we see is almost entirely dusty villages and a drug lord's vulgar mansion, which is Hollywood shorthand going back decades rather than anything resembling how most Mexican people actually live. Now, the defense, and I think the defense is substantial. Gustavo Fring is arguably the single best constructed character in the series, and possibly the best constructed villain on television, full stop. He is Chilean, played by Giancarlo Esposito, and he is given more interiority than almost anyone. The discipline, the rage underneath it, the grief for Max that powers 20 years of patience, the fast food manager persona worn like a suit. He is not a stereotype in any direction. He is his own thing entirely. Stephen Gomez is a competent working DEA agent who is good at his job and has never made the butt of anything. Hector Salamanca becomes, particularly once Better Call Saul fills him in, a considerably stranger and more specific figure than the bell-ringing gargoyle he first appears to be. The show also lets Spanish run without subtitles in places, which is a choice that treats bilingualism as ordinary rather than as decoration. So it isn't a simple case, it's a show that starts with the shorthand and then spends years complicating it. And there's a structural reading of the final season that I find genuinely persuasive, which is that the show noticed the problem itself. Because when Walt reaches his endgame, who is he up against? Not the cartel is gone. His final antagonists are Uncle Jack and a compound full of white supremacists in the New Mexico desert, and Todd, who is about as Aryan as television gets. The violence that finishes the story is entirely homegrown. Some critics read that as the show quietly answering its own charge sheet. You thought the danger came from over the border, and actually it was in the house the whole time. Whether that was deliberate, I have no idea. It works either way. There's one more strand of criticism worth mentioning because it comes from viewers rather than from press, and it's persistent. Spanish-speaking audiences have complained fairly consistently about both Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. That the written Spanish and some of the delivery are not good. Stilted lines, odd constructions, accents that don't sit where the character is supposed to be from. That's a smaller point than the representational one, but it's a real one, and it's the sort of thing that's invisible to a monolingual audience and grating to everyone else. Here's where I land, and I'll try to be honest rather than diplomatic. I think the criticism lands on season 1 and 2 and gets progressively less applicable after that. The early show reached for the nearest available shorthand for danger, which was the same shorthand American television had been reaching for since the 70s. And it did it without much thought. That's fair to say. I think the criticism overreaches when it's applied to the show as a whole because Gus Fring exists, and because you cannot write off a series for flat portrayal when its most carefully built human being is the one they're supposedly flattening. And since we're in the neighborhood, one detail I always want people to know because it goes the other way entirely. RJ Mita, who plays Walt Jr., has cerebral palsy. Actual cerebral palsy, diagnosed as a child. He was cast to play a character with cerebral palsy, which in 2007 was rare and, depressingly, still is. He spent the year since talking about how routinely those roles go to actors without the condition, and about the crutches he actually used growing up versus the ones the production gave him, which were a bit different from his own. Whatever else you say about the show's casting choices, that one they got right, and got right early, and it barely got discussed at the time. There's a sweet shop in Old Town Albuquerque called the Candy Lady, and it has been there since long before any of this happened. The owner is Debbie Ball. In the early seasons, the production needed something that looked like crystal methamphetamine and was safe for actors to handle. And the answer to that problem is blue rock candy, which is a thing sweet shops have always made. So she supplied the prop for the first couple of seasons. Then the show got enormous, and she did the obvious thing, which was to start selling the same blue rock candy to the public in little bags for $1 each. She sold tens of thousands of them. By early 2013, the figure being reported was around 20,000 bags, and that was before the final run of episodes, and the finale and the tourism spike that came after all of it. She also started running limousine tours around the filming locations with a driver dressed as Walter White, which is either extremely cynical or extremely enterprising depending on your mood, and honestly, I think it's just a woman running a small business in a city where something unexpected happened. She was quoted at the time saying the show was amazing and that she didn't live too far from Walter White's house, which, given everything we've already covered about that particular property, is a sentence with rather a lot going on underneath it. She wasn't alone. Frank Sandoval built a whole operation running tours in a replica RV, and he said something to Time about his own customers that has stayed with me. In some cases, he said, the show has become a drug for people. That's a tour operator saying that about his own clientele. Not a critic, not a psychologist. The man selling the tickets. Now, since we're on the subject of the merchandise, the licensed side of it is where I start to raise an eyebrow. And I'll be careful here because I don't think there's a villain in this section, just a set of decisions that look odd when you line them up. There is a Breaking Bad slot machine. IGT built it. A proper full-size casino cabinet with a big screen mounted above the reels, playing clips from the actual show while you play. Walt, Jesse, Skylar, and Hank on the reels. The RV. Barrels of methylamine. Chemistry symbols as the low-value icons. Bonus rounds with names built out of the show's vocabulary. There is a later online version from a different developer with jackpots and free spin features and a maximum win advertised in multiples of your stake. So, a story about addiction licensed into a machine that is engineered quite openly to be addictive. I'm not going to get sanctimonious about it. Gambling machines exist. They get licensed themes, and the theme is usually whatever is popular. Nobody at IGT sat down intending to make a point. But the point exists anyway, and it makes me laugh in a way I'm not entirely comfortable with. There's a version of Walter White who would find the whole arrangement extremely funny and would say something insufferable about it. Then there's the Super Bowl ad, February 2023. Frito-Lay put a brand called Popcorners in the biggest advertising slot in the world, and what they bought was a Breaking Bad reunion. Cranston and Paul back in the RV in character a decade after the show ended. Raymond Cruz back as Tuco. Walt in the yellow hazmat suit rolling a barrel through the desert in a shot that deliberately recreates one of the most desolate images in the entire series. Written and directed by Vince Gilligan himself. The joke, obviously, is that they're cooking snacks instead. Air-popped, not fried, Walt gets to be a perfectionist about corn. And it went down brilliantly. It won polls. One university advertising class that has run the same competition for 2 decades voted it the best ad of the night, top of the table in likability, persuasiveness, and brand identity. People loved it. Fast Company asked the obvious question in their write-up, which was, what does a crime drama known for brutal violence and the drug trade have in common with a healthier snack brand? And they answered it themselves. Honestly, nobody cares, which I think is exactly right and is also the whole thing in miniature. By 2023, the show had been metabolized so completely that its imagery could be used to sell corn chips at halftime, and the only reaction was delight. Nobody wrote a stern column. The cautionary tale had become a mood board. I'm not sure how I feel about that. I laughed at the advert. I've watched it more than once. And there's a small part of me that notes we have arrived at a place where the visual language of a man's moral collapse is a snack campaign, and everyone is fine. And then there's the footnote, which is the strangest thing I found while putting this together. In September 2013, in the run-up to the finale, there was a contest connected to Aaron Paul. Make a donation to a charity, get entered, and the winner would be flown to Los Angeles to watch the last episode with the cast at a private party. The winner was a 28-year-old from Fort Myers, Florida, called Ryan Lee Carroll. He gave interviews to the local press beforehand, as you would, and he said the show was so good that you couldn't stop watching it. Highly addicting, he told one reporter, just like the meth they make. He flew out, he went to the party, he got a hazmat suit signed by the cast. On New Year's Eve, 3 months later, the Lee County Sheriff's Office raided a property he was renting. According to the sheriff, the garage had been converted into a manufacturing setup for synthetic cannabinoids, mixed in a cement mixer, flavored, packaged in colorful wrappers, and posted around the country. They put the value of what they seized at over $1 million. 2 other men were arrested. Among the items investigators took away was the signed hazmat suit. I read that detail 3 times to make sure I hadn't imagined it. A souvenir from a television show about a man running a drug operation out of a suburban house, logged into evidence at a drug operation in a suburban house. I don't have a clever conclusion for that. Sometimes a thing is just extraordinary and you have to leave it where it is. On the 29th of July, 2022, Vince Gilligan stood at a microphone in Albuquerque and criticized his own gift before anyone else had the chance. The occasion was the unveiling of 2 bronze statues at the Albuquerque Convention Center. Walter White and Jesse Pinkman, life-size, about 500 pounds each. Commissioned by Sony Pictures Television and donated to the city along with Gilligan, with no taxpayer money involved. Cranston and Aaron Paul both turned up to pose next to their metal counterparts, which must be an unsettling experience. Gilligan's remarks are the reason this section exists, because he got there first. He said out loud at the ceremony that no doubt some folks were going to say, wow, just what our city needed. And he said he got that. He understood it. He wasn't pretending it was uncomplicated. Then he gave his own reading. He said he saw 2 of the finest actors America has ever produced in character as 2 larger-than-life tragic figures. Cautionary tales. That's a fairly precise word to reach for. Not heroes, not icons, cautionary tales. He'd clearly thought about how this would land in a state with a genuine methamphetamine problem, and he decided to say the difficult part himself rather than let someone else say it for him. It didn't help. Of course it didn't help. About 2 weeks later, the criticism arrived, and it arrived through Fox News. Rod Montoya, a Republican state representative, put it bluntly. He said he was glad New Mexico got the business, but really, were they going down the road of literally glorifying meth makers? And Eddie Aragon, a conservative talk radio host in Albuquerque who'd run for mayor and lost, went considerably further. He said it wasn't the type of recognition he wanted for the city or the state. And then he said something that I think is the most interesting line in the entire episode. That what you saw on Breaking Bad should be a documentary, honestly. That's the reality in New Mexico. We try to say it's fictional, but that is the reality, which is, if you unpick it, a strange argument to make against the statues. He's not saying the show is a lurid exaggeration that traduces his state. He's saying it's basically accurate. His objection is to being reminded. Aragon also tied it to something else, which is where the local politics gets thick. Albuquerque had removed a statue of Juan de Oñate, the Spanish conquistador, following protests over his treatment of indigenous people. So Aragon's framing was, it's fine to get rid of real historical figures, and now it's somehow better to install fictional drug-dealing ones. Whatever you think of that comparison, and it's doing a great deal of work, it explains why this became a proper political story rather than a 2-day joke. The mayor's office answered on economics, which was always going to be the answer. Tim Keller's position was that the positive impact of the cast and crew on the local economy and film industry could not be minimized, and his office put a figure on it. Over $385 million in economic impact across the franchise, lifting up countless local businesses. Keller himself added something a bit more thoughtful than a spreadsheet. While the stories might be fictional, he said, the jobs are real every single day. The city is also a character. We see ourselves in so many ways, good and bad. That last clause is the honest one, and I suspect it's why he got away with it. There's a local voice in the coverage I keep thinking about too. A local candy shop owner who put it about as plainly as it can be put. That brings people here. It provides Old Town with an income. It provides me with an income. And that's the actual argument, isn't it? Not aesthetics, not morality, rent. Here's where I come down, for whatever it's worth. And I'll be honest that I've gone back and forth. I don't think a statue of a fictional character glorifies anything in particular. Nobody looks at bronze Jesse Pinkman and thinks, right, that's the career for me. If a 500-pound sculpture in a convention center lobby had that kind of persuasive power, we'd have solved advertising decades ago. But I do understand the discomfort, and I understand it better having read Aragon's line about it being a documentary. There's a difference between a city being famous for a story and a city being famous for the thing the story's about. Albuquerque didn't get to choose which one it became. It got the tourism and the film industry and the convention bookings, and it also got a permanent global association with a drug that is genuinely wrecking parts of the American Southwest. Both things are true at once, and they don't cancel out. The statues are still there, by the way. They didn't come down, there was no compromise, no plaque added. The story simply stopped being a story, the way these things do, and now they're just two bronze men standing in a lobby while people walk past them to conferences about dentistry. Every so often, somebody asks the question directly, usually with a slightly nervous laugh. And it's a fair question. Could you learn anything from it? The short answer is no. The long answer is much more interesting because of who was in the room. Start with the consultants, because there were more of them than people assume. Bryan Cranston confirmed in an interview with High Times, of all publications, that the Drug Enforcement Administration served as technical consultants on the show, which sounds mad until you hear his explanation for why they agreed. His account is that the agency worked out it was in their own interest to be involved because the alternative was a wildly popular program spreading a version of the drug trade that bore no relation to what they actually deal with. Better to be in the room and steer it than to be outside it complaining. So DEA chemists came in and walked Cranston and Aaron Paul through the process, not letting them do it, obviously, explaining it. Cranston later told Howard Stern that they never actually produced anything. They were simply shown step by step how it works, so their hands would look right and their vocabulary would be correct. On the legitimate science side, there was Donna Nelson, a chemistry professor at the University of Oklahoma, who volunteered herself to the production after reading an interview where Gilligan mentioned wanting the chemistry to be accurate. She checked equations, tidied up dialogue, corrected diagrams on whiteboards. She has been very clear about the limits of her involvement, and I think she's admirable for it. She helped with the high school chemistry and the general scientific literacy of the scripts. She did not help with the illicit lab scenes. That was the DEA's business, not hers, which produces an unusual arrangement. A show with a government drug agency handling one department and a university professor handling the other, and a firewall between them. And the show was, by most expert assessments, unusually good. Ralph Weisheit, a criminal justice professor at Illinois State who studies the actual meth trade, described it as a mix of truth and fiction with a considerably heavier dose of truth than you normally find in television drama. That's about as strong an endorsement as an academic will give you in public. But it is not a manual, and it was never allowed to be one. Steps are missing. Steps are wrong. Sequences are compressed and rearranged. Everyone involved has been quite open that this was deliberate, that the point was for it to feel right rather than be right, and that anyone attempting to follow along at home would get nowhere. which is presumably why the actual outcomes in the real world were, as we covered earlier, so consistently pathetic. There was a man in Hemel Hempstead who ended up at St. Albans Crown Court after telling a jury he'd had a great idea to make it after watching the show. The recorder sentencing him told him, in open court, that it was a sign of his stupidity that he watched a television program and thought he could manufacture a drug, and added that he was 37 and ought to know better by that age. That's a judge in Hertfordshire delivering a review of the audience. Since we're on the subject, the errors are worth a run-through because they're genuinely fun, and because Slate did a lovely job of collecting them at the end of the run. The most quoted one, there's a scene where Walt uses red phosphorus and hot water to produce phosphine gas and incapacitate two men in the RV. Jonathan Hare, a chemist writing for the BBC, pointed out that red phosphorus and hydrogen will get you there. Red phosphorus and hot water will not. So the show's very first demonstration of Walt's genius is, chemically, a bit of a fudge. There's no element with the symbol CH, which the show at one point puts on screen. The famous hydrofluoric acid in the bathtub has been picked over for years, including by the Mythbusters. The acid will do horrifying things to flesh and bone. That part is fair. Whether it eats through a domestic bathtub and a first-floor ceiling is a good deal less certain, because bathtubs are not made of the one material the acid is best at attacking, and the product itself is wrong in the most visible possible way. Donna Nelson has said it herself. What Walt is described as synthesizing should be white. The blue is a dramatic invention. The entire signature of the character, the thing that becomes his brand and gets copied by real dealers into a genuinely dangerous knockoff, is the one detail that has no chemical basis at all. I love that personally. The most consequential piece of chemistry in the show is the piece the chemists say couldn't happen. There's a smaller inaccuracy that a former user pointed out in GQ, and I think it matters more than the phosphine business. The show occasionally depicts effects that are closer to hallucination, and methamphetamine can in fact work that way. It isn't a hallucinogen. That's the sort of error that shapes how an audience understands a drug, and it's less forgivable than getting a reaction backwards. The bigger question sitting underneath all of this is whether accuracy was even the right goal, and I've changed my mind about it over the years. Because there's an argument, and it's not a stupid one, that a drama about the drug trade has a duty to be roughly true. People form their entire picture of methamphetamine from this show. That's a lot of responsibility to hand to a writer's room in Burbank. And there's a counter-argument, which is that the accuracy was always in service of something other than education. The chemistry had to be plausible so that Walt's expertise would feel real, because the entire character rests on the idea that this unremarkable man is genuinely verifiably the best in the world at one specific thing. If the science looked fake, the tragedy wouldn't land. That's what the consultants were for. Nelson has said she got letters and calls from students who went into chemistry because of the show. One caller on a radio program said as much live on air that he'd decided to go back to college and study it, which is an outcome nobody could have predicted from a drama about a man poisoning children, and which I find quietly delightful. The show made some people want to be chemists and made a very small number of extremely troubled people want to be criminals. And the ratio between those two groups is not close. There's a scene about 2/3 of the way through season 2 that a lot of people consider the moment the show stopped being about a man in trouble and started being about a man who is the trouble. And unlike almost everything else in this video, the argument about it happened inside the production first. Jane Margolis is Jesse's girlfriend and landlady. Kristen Ritter plays her, and plays her extremely well as someone smart and funny and about 18 months into a recovery that is not going to hold. She relapses. She pulls Jesse with her. She works out who Walt is and tries to extort him, which is a genuinely threatening act and which the show does not soften. And then Walt comes to the flat to talk to Jesse, finds them both unconscious, and in the process of shaking Jesse awake, he knocks Jane onto her back. She starts to choke. He could roll her over. It would take one hand and about 2 seconds. He reaches out and he stops and he stands there and watches her die. Cranston plays it without a line of dialogue, and it's the best thing he does in the entire series. There's a moment where his face registers what he's doing and then decides to keep doing it. And if you freeze it at the right instant, you can see the exact frame where Walter White ends. The controversy around this scene is not really about whether it should exist. Almost nobody argues that. It's about the two things attached to it. The first is the depiction of the overdose itself. Some viewers found it too clinical, too still, insufficiently horrified by itself, and there was a strand of criticism at the time about whether the show was treating a young woman's death primarily as a plot mechanism for a male character's development, which is a legitimate reading and one I have some sympathy with, because Jane exists for about 8 episodes and her main narrative function is to die and cause consequences. She is beautifully written for those 6 episodes. She is still a woman whose purpose in the architecture is to be lost. Better Call Saul, incidentally, does something small and lovely about this years later by giving her a life outside Jesse's story. But that's a different video. The second attachment is Donald, her father, and this is where the argument gets properly interesting. Because Jane's death does not stop at Jane. Her father is an air traffic controller. He returns to work grieving, and everything we already covered about Season 2's ending follows from that. And 167 people die because a man in a bedroom in Albuquerque decided not to move his hand. That chain is either the most elegant thing the show ever did or the most contrived, depending entirely on which side of the argument you came down on back in 2009. What I'd add now, with distance, is that the two scenes are the same scene. You cannot really have an opinion about the planes without having an opinion about the bedroom, because the planes are just the bedroom continuing outward until it runs out of sky. There's a piece of behind-the-scenes information about the filming that gets shared a lot, and it's worth handling gently. Cranston has spoken publicly about what he was thinking about while shooting it, and it involved his own daughter, and how standing over a young woman and doing nothing put him somewhere he found genuinely distressing. He's described it as one of the hardest days he had on the show. Ritter has said similar things about the physical experience of playing it. I mention that not as gossip, but because it's the answer to a question people ask about scenes like this, which is whether the people making them are as affected as the people watching them. Sometimes they are, sometimes more. And then there's what the scene does to the rewatch, which is my favorite thing about it, and the reason it belongs in a video about controversy at all. Because after this, every argument about whether Walt is sympathetic has to route through it. You can defend the money. You can defend Crazy 8 in the basement as self-defense, more or less. You can defend a great deal of what he does as a man reacting badly to a situation he didn't choose. You cannot defend this. There is no version of standing still and watching someone choke that is a reaction. It's a decision made in real time by a man who had already worked out that the world was easier without her in it. And the show puts it in Season 2, not Season 5. Season 2 with 3 seasons still to run, which means everything that follows happens after we already know. Whenever someone tells me they're on Walt's side, I don't argue with them about the finale. I ask them about the bedroom. Nobody has ever had an answer for me yet. The last argument I want to talk about tonight is one the show had with itself, and it's about whether any of this should have continued at all. Breaking Bad ended on the 29th of September, 2013. 62 episodes, 5 seasons, a finale that landed hard enough to become the reference point for how to end a television program. Whatever quibbles anyone had about it being too tidy, and we've covered those, the overwhelming feeling at the time was relief. It stuck the landing. That almost never happens. And then it kept going. Better Call Saul arrived in 2015 and ran for 6 seasons, which is more episodes than the original. El Camino turned up on Netflix in October 2019 as a feature-length sequel following Jesse in the hours immediately after the finale. And there's been a steady drip of adjacent material ever since, up to and including that snack advert we talked about. Now, I want to be upfront. I think Better Call Saul is extraordinary. There are people who will tell you it's the better show, and I don't think they're mad. But it did produce a real argument, and the argument is worth laying out properly because it's the one that comes up every time a beloved series gets extended. The case against roughly goes like this. A finale is a promise. When Breaking Bad ended, it ended with a set of things unknown, and those unknowns were doing work. Where did Jesse go? We didn't know, and the not knowing was the point because it let the audience decide whether he got out or whether the car ride into the dark was just a different kind of ending. Some people found that ambiguity almost unbearable and loved it for exactly that reason. El Camino answers it explicitly. And the moment you answer a question like that, the previous version of it stops existing. You can never go back to not knowing. The reviews were broadly positive, but the criticism that recurred was that it wasn't necessary. That it was a very well-made 2 hours, which did not, in the end, tell us anything the last shot of the finale hadn't already implied. Aaron Paul is excellent in it. Gilligan directs it beautifully, and it functions primarily as reassurance. The counter-argument, which Gilligan has essentially made himself, is more human than critical. He's talked about caring what happened to that character, about wanting to see him get somewhere, about the fact that the ending gave Walt a resolution and gave Jesse a car. Which is true. Walt gets a conclusion of his own design, and Jesse gets an escape into an unspecified nowhere, and if you love that character, that asymmetry nags. So which is it? A necessary act of care or an unnecessary act of tidying? I think it's both, and I think the honest thing to say is that El Camino is a gift for people who wanted it and slightly diminishes the finale for people who didn't. Those two facts coexist and no amount of arguing resolves them because they're not really about the film. They're about whether you think stories belong to their endings or to their characters. There's a second strand of this, and it's about the cameos. Both the film and the last stretch of Better Call Saul bring back faces from the original, and the reaction to that has always been split. Some viewers find it thrilling, others find it a bit like being nudged in the ribs, and there's a fair criticism that a returning character carries so much freight that they distort the scene around them. You stop watching the story and start watching the reunion. Better Call Saul mostly handles this well, in my view, because it earns its returns rather than deploying them. But there were episodes where I could feel the show being pulled towards fan service and having to resist, and Gilligan and Peter Gould have both talked in interviews about the discipline required to not just give people what they wanted every week, which raises the wider point, and this is where I'll leave it. The thing that made Breaking Bad remarkable was that it was finite. 62 episodes planned to end, with a network that had wanted fewer and a studio that had to fight for more. Gilligan called 16 episodes a great gift precisely because it was a fixed number, and a fixed number is what lets you build a shape. Almost nothing gets to be finite anymore. Everything successful becomes a universe. There are spin-offs, prequels, sequel films, animated shorts, mobile games, and eventually a bronze statue in a convention center. That's not a Breaking Bad problem, that's the industry, and Breaking Bad resisted it longer and more gracefully than almost anything of comparable size. But it did eventually become a franchise. There's a word for that process that people use dismissively, and I don't think it's quite right here, because the extensions were made with genuine care by the same people. It isn't cynical. Nobody licensed this out to a stranger to grind out content. It's just that the show, which was famous for knowing when to stop, has now, on the record, not stopped for about 18 years. I don't have a complaint filed. I watched all of it, and I'd watch more. There's simply something quietly funny about a cautionary tale on the subject of a man who couldn't walk away from a thing he was good at, becoming a body of work that nobody involved can quite walk away from either. Gilligan, to be fair, seems fully aware of that. He's moved on to entirely new things and has been fairly firm that he doesn't want to spend his career in one desert. And when he does look back, he tends to do it briefly and with a joke attached, which is probably the healthiest available approach. Anyway, that's the last of them. Let's go back to Piermont Drive, quietly this time. A family bought a house in 1973 and lived in it. In 2006, somebody knocked and asked to film the outside for a pilot, and they said yes, because why wouldn't you? The show ended in 2013, and it took them until 2026 to get out. That's more than a decade of strangers on the lawn after the thing itself had finished. Whatever you think about everything else in this video, that's the bit I keep turning over. Because here's what I noticed putting all of this together. Almost none of it is about the writing. Nobody in any of these stories is arguing that the show was badly made. There's no scandal about the scripts, no revolt over a season everyone hated, no creative collapse. The critics loved it, the audience loved it, the awards agreed. Even the fiercest arguments in here, the bad fan business, the questions about who got to be complicated, are arguments about a thing being too effective rather than not effective enough. What people fought over was the residue, what it left behind in a real city, on a real street, in a real drug supply, in the inbox of an actress who had done nothing but her job very well. Stories don't stay where you put them. That's not a profound observation, it's just true, and this one is a particularly clean demonstration of it. A man wrote a story about a chemistry teacher, and it ended up in a Supreme Court opinion, on a casino floor, in a cemetery in Albuquerque, and in a bag of blue crystal being sold at double price to somebody who watched the same episodes you did. Nobody planned any of that. Nobody could have. One more thought before I let you go, and it's a small one. Of all the material I went through putting this together, the thing that surprised me most wasn't any of the crimes or the lawsuits or the statues. It was how often the people involved behaved better than you'd expect. Cranston made a joke instead of a statement. The woman with the petition liked the show and said so. The Journal printed the gag obituary and then, the next day, printed a list of real charities that help real addicts in that city. Gilligan stood at a microphone and criticized his own gift before anyone else could. The cemetery manager, who had every commercial reason to keep a tourist attraction on his land, said his allegiance was to the families who'd buried people there and then removed it. Almost nobody in this video is the villain. There's a lot of people doing their best with something none of them planned for, and quite a few of them managing it with a certain amount of grace. That's not usually how these stories go. I noticed it, and I thought it was worth saying out loud. I've got a couple of things I want to do next in this vein if you're interested. There's a Better Call Saul companion piece I've been circling for a while, because that show has its own set of arguments and almost none of them are the same ones. And I'd quite like to do something on Pluribus and on how quietly Gilligan reuses his own furniture, including a certain airline name that anyone who sat through season 2 will clock immediately and then feel slightly ill about. But that's for another night. Thanks for staying up with me wherever you are. Sleep well.